But here in France you have, or in Europe as a whole, because of the European Union, because of Maastricht, individual governments can't act for their people. They've basically put a limit on what a government can do. And now in Germany, in France, they're putting through policies that are going to kill people. You've got in much of the world, look what's happening in southern Africa with the chaos in Kenya that's being introduced, with the attacks on the government of Zimbabwe. There's going to be riots and civil war that's going to end up destroying the potential that's never been realized in those countries because of the continuing effects of European colonialism. So this is what you have to look at when we talk about tragedy. And then you take the other side of it. You have countries like India, China, and Russia that are trying to move. The Indians just the Prime Minister of India, Singh, just made a decision. He's not going to go with Japan, Australia, and the United States. He's going to China. The Russians are making it very clear they're not going to go along with this insanity. And so what's the response? The British organized the assassination of Benazir Bhutto to blow up the Indian subcontinent at a point where the Middle East is a tinderbox. I mean, what could be more dangerous than sending the highly damaged President George W. Bush into the Middle East to say, I want peace. We need peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. What would Jesus do? You know, Bush has been studying Jesus lately, and he figured that Jesus had a pretty good legacy, so he's going to try and imitate Jesus for his legacy. So the question comes down to the United States. Now, I want to present this in the following way. If you were going to do a drama 50 years from now about the United States in this period, would you focus on a person who's losing his home because he got suckered into a predatory loan, an ARM that he couldn't afford? Or would you possibly focus on Bill and Hillary Clinton? With the proviso that if we do our job, the next months will ensure that Hillary is not a tragic figure. And I want to say we're not supporting Hillary for president at this point, although Hillary is the person who has made some steps towards becoming qualified to be president by what she's done since the Iowa primary. But this gets to the question that Arthur Miller poses in an essay he wrote in 1949 in the New York Times called Tragedy and the Common Man. Now, the question of tragedy in drama is who's the subject of the tragedy? And what Lynn has argued against the present-day hegemonic British view, this is what they teach in Britain, and this is the view that's now been accepted at Harvard, Pepperdine, Southwest Texas State University. The view of tragedy is the view that Arthur Miller suggests, which is where you have one person who has a flaw, who's up against a destiny that's powerful, a fate that's very big, and that the person fights to the death to try to address what they see as a personal indignity. I'll see if I can have the quotes here. He says, I think the tragic feeling is invoked in us when we are in the presence of a character who is ready to lay down his life, if need be, to secure one thing, his sense of personal dignity. Now, if you think about that and you think about the character Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman, or any of the characters in the plays you've seen, it is a lot about someone trying to say my life has some meaning. I'm going to act to do something against all these odds, to do something that's good. In the case of Willy Loman, in the end, he kills himself because the American dream has failed him. He's unable to live up to the delusion he has in his own mind about what's the American dream. Now, here's the problem with that view of tragedy. It's not to say that individuals don't face tragic consequences because of these situations in society. And it's not even the case that, well, we care more about a king or a powerful figure because they could do so much more than my next door neighbor Joe. That's partly what Miller's saying is, shouldn't the next door neighbor Joe get his justice? Shouldn't he get his due? Shouldn't we be concerned about the collectivity of individuals who face desperate situations and instead of capitulating, stand up and try to fight for that higher justice? Well, that's commendable. The fact is that if you understand tragedy from the standpoint of the Greek tragedians, particularly Aeschylus and Sophocles, even Euripides, and then the two great modern European dramatists, tragedians, Shakespeare and Schiller, they're dealing with another question. They're dealing with this question of how do you evoke in an audience the emotional connection, the pathos, so to speak, evoke a feeling of pity or compassion for what's going on stage, not for the individual, but in such a way to create a new sense emerging in the mind of the person in the audience. So that it's not just what they see and hear. What Lynn is talking about in tragedy this is the same thing he talks about in science, that you can't trust your eyes, you can't trust your hearing. You have to develop a sense in the mind that gives you a prescience of something beyond the visual and the what you can hear. And this is why the music question is so tough. Because you're trying to develop an ear which is not the physical ear that takes in sounds. This question of the higher faculty is a different sense, an educated sense of reason, which only human beings have. You'd never see squirrels putting on a tragedy about the squirrel that got run over chasing a pretty female squirrel going across the street or something. But there's a quality in human beings that has to be activated to escape fate. And it's not just seeking to overcome personal indignation. If that's all it were, then the emotion might be anger as opposed to the empathetic, what Schiller calls the pathetic. Schiller wrote a very fascinating essay called On the Pleasure We Get from Seeing Tragic Things. Now think about that for a moment. What kind of pleasure could you possibly get, unless you were really a misogynist, a bad person, from seeing something tragic? And of course he doesn't mean the people standing on the side of the road gawking at a body in the street that's been run over. He's talking again about that higher quality. What's the pleasure? That sense of longing for something better, for being able to act in such a way that you can change the whole of society. And so when Arthur Miller says that you're moved by the story of someone who's willing to lay down his life to secure one thing, a sense of personal dignity, it could be Willy Loman, it could be Rambo. The thing is not the individual. You have to get beyond that. The individual, in fact, and then, the second point that Lynn makes is that you're not looking at the flaw of the leading figure. One of the things that people do is they because of the way our society is weak, you look for a hero. You look for some figure that is better than everyone around you. And so you cheer for the hero. And you feel the pain of the hero when he falls. Take the case of Hamlet, as Lynn often does. There are very interesting qualities, decent qualities to Hamlet. He's very bright, very quick, rapier wit. Someone who seems like he'd make a good king. Except for the problem that he does not act to change the society. Now, Shakespeare's play is not about how Hamlet stands there and says, gee, let me add it up. My father got killed probably by his brother, who then married my mother. And meanwhile, they're screwing and drinking and the country's going to hell. I should do something about it. No, in the play, Hamlet sees all that, but he's captured by, as Lynn says, an unseen force in the play. Although you see the force in the play. You see it in the ghost, in the opening, where the ghost seizes Hamlet and says, "Avenge me, my most foul murder." And so Hamlet is controlled by that. He doesn't break out. So if you're sitting there in the audience saying, "Come on, Hamlet, do something good, kill the king." "Oh no, Hamlet, don't drink from the hemlock. Watch out, your uncle's poisoned your sword. Oh no." And then Horatio comes along. You don't get it. Horatio says, "Good night, sweet prince. May wings of angels take you to your rest," or something like that. Thus here lies the, I can't remember the specifics, but the romantic tears up. Poor Hamlet. He tried to avenge something bad. And he did. He did kill his uncle. But what happened? Horatio is brought up to tell you what happened. And he tells you the story. In a sense, it's not exactly Horatio telling you the play, but in a sense it is. And what does he tell you? He says, look at this whole conjuncture and see what happened to our society so you will do better. So it's not for the audience to cheer for the individual to do better. It's Shakespeare saying to the audience, exciting that sixth sense in the audience, that you can be better. These figures on stage, they were all flawed. The whole society was flawed. And no one could break out of that, no matter whether they had good qualities or not. That's what a tragedy is. When you're looking at a society. Now, another example Lynn uses, the Don Carlos, which many of you are familiar with, where Schiller, being a brilliant historian, develops this whole scenario. It's not actually historically accurate, but it's totally psychologically accurate. Because what was Philip II? He was a nasty bigot. Some of you are now reading the Revolt of the Netherlands, which was Schiller's case study of what was going on in Spain. What was wrong with Philip? It wasn't just that Philip had the Inquisition over him, although he did. It's that Philip was an extremely narrow, bigoted person. And for him, religion was a club to enhance his power. And so, who's the person who's most trapped by this? His son? No. His wife, Elizabeth. The one character in the play who actually sees what's unfolding. In a sense, it's through Elizabeth that the audience's empathy, the audience's pathos is moved. Because you see a decent person who came from a better country, France, who is, I'm being serious, I'm not attacking your homeland. Elizabeth was a good woman. She tried, but she didn't have any power. Philip was like these newscasters who were attacking Hillary. You're a woman. You look at the scenes with Elizabeth. How does Philip treat her? Would you like to be treated that way if you're a woman by your husband? And yet Elizabeth is clearly the best person in the play. She tells Posa, your plots are not going to work, you idiot. She looks at Don Carlos and fears for his life. Does it change them? Does it stop them? No, because that was the nature of the whole society. That's why Spain went in, marched into the Netherlands, and slaughtered tens of thousands of people. And that's why ultimately Philip bankrupted his own country, destroyed the economy of Spain, and someone in Schiller's time would see that play and say, our country has a lot of those same similarities. And would identify with Elizabeth, not by saying, oh, she's so wonderful. Oh, the makeup is so good. What a good actress. No, they would have this sense in looking at her of, on the one hand, the desire not to be helpless in a similar situation. How do we act so that we don't get trapped that way? Now, there's the other part, and this is my biggest beef with Arthur Miller, is that he's clearly writing about a specific moment in history. He came out of the Depression. He was actually, his first opportunity to work as a playwright was in the Federal Theater program that was set up as part of the WPA, one of Roosevelt's New Deal programs. And at the same time, he saw exactly what Clifford Odets saw, another dramatist from that, about 10 years older than Miller. But look at the difference between Odets' play The Big Knife, which Robert Beltran put on in Los Angeles a few years ago, and the Miller plays. Take Death of a Salesman. Clearly, Willy Loman is a product of post-World War II, right after World War II. The idea, all of a sudden, things are opening up. They have a suburban house, Lefrak City, which really doesn't look like the suburbs today if you go into New York, but that's obviously what it is, although you wouldn't know. There's no reference to any moment of that moment's historically specific events. And so what you could otherwise say is this is a study of the immediate post-war period and how it is that people who, in the case of Willy Loman, maybe was too old to fight in World War II, but how he was left out. He never had a sense of the potential. For him, it was all, I'm going to be the best salesman. My kids are going to be the best kids. Now, look on the other side at what Clifford Odets does with the opening of The Big Knife, where they're sitting around and they're talking about what? They're talking about Trumanism. They're saying the dead were not those left on the beaches of France, but the ones who came back. They're talking about the Trumanism, the anti-communism, the immediate attempt to take the returning veterans and say to them, okay, you were heroic, now you've got to make a living. And so it's historically specific. I mean, in that sense, Odets was very clear on that, where Miller is not so clear. But then you look at the deeper question on historic specificity. What is it that's important about the period from 1940 to 1950? The period when Miller was writing All My Sons, right? Well, that was the immediate period when this happened to the veterans coming home. And the key figures, if you really wanted to capture that, and I think someone like Miller could have done it. He may have been afraid. Look, Miller and Odets were brought before HUAC, the House Un-American Affairs Committee. There were writers whose careers were snuffed out because they went to a rally to support a political prisoner and they were accused of being communists. This is what was done in the 1940s, 1947, the Hollywood 10. People who have seen Ed Asner know Ed Asner. He knows the people who were brought before the Congress, and if they refused to testify, they were thrown in prison. They were blacklisted. They were no longer allowed to write. And in the case of Odets and Miller both were friends with Elia Kazan, who went before the committee and did testify and gave them both up. Even though in Odets' case, he said, I was never a member of the Communist Party. I had the misfortune of being a premature anti-fascist. In other words, he was against fascism when many in the United States still supported fascism. And so after the war, if you had been against Hitler in the 30s, they called you a communist. Arthur Miller in 1957 was brought before HUAC. He wouldn't testify, and he was given a 6-month jail sentence. And eventually the appeals court kept him out of it. But imagine, you just got married to Marilyn Monroe and you're given a 6-month jail sentence. That's tough. That's harsh. Or so I assume. So they lived in a time when it was difficult to speak the truth. So what would be a good subject if you were a dramatist for that period? How about Truman, the littleness of Truman following the death of FDR? What about Douglas MacArthur, who was fired by Truman? Now, Miller actually tried to do something to attack McCarthyism. But instead of going directly at it, he wrote a play on the Salem witch trials called The Crucible, which is an interesting play. But Joe McCarthy was running around terrorizing and threatening anybody who fought for a decent standard of living for working people. Yeah.
I would say though, what about in Shakespeare's case? He never brought up the aristocracy of the time directly in any of his plays. He went back before.
Well, again,
in his examples.
That's right. But what I'm saying is that he approached it from the standpoint of the top of the society. How it was that the people who were in positions of power and influence created these countries that were terrible. For example, all the Plantagenet plays, from Richard II to Richard III, with the Henrys, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, Henry V. Now, Henry V was a hero, even in Shakespeare's time. And there are heroic aspects to Henry V. His speech, we few, we brave few, we band of brothers. When he encourages a smaller force of English soldiers to destroy the French in the Battle of Agincourt. And he says, years from now, on St. Crispin's Day, people who were home in their bed when you're out here fighting will claim they were there. It's a totally inspirational speech. Problem is, what was it for? It was going to war against France. Why were they going to war against France? Because he was told by his father, if you don't go to war against France, you're going to have to fight the nobility in your own country. So why didn't Henry V say, well, screw you, Pops, I'm going to take on the corruption in our own family? No, he said, okay, France was against my daddy, so I'm going to go in and punish France. Like the Bushes, right? Once again, France. Eh? There's an underlying theme here. Now, what actually ends up happening in the Shakespeare series on Henry V? If you're in the audience watching it, you'd be moved at times. Henry seemed to be pretty sharp, but you have to realize, what's he doing? He's launching his nation in a series of wars in France for no purpose other than to avoid the internal fights in England. Now, Shakespeare writing that at the time he wrote it, do you think people in the audience might have thought, gee, is that going on here between the Tudors and others? So the literate population in his time could make that connection. Just as when Shakespeare wrote about Hamlet, the question of the succession. What happens in a society that's corrupt and there's no obvious succession? Shouldn't the people be concerned about who's going to be the next king or queen? And so, in a way, he could keep himself from being killed by writing these historical plays, but showing the flaws of the whole society. And these are stories that still live with us today. They're still totally valid today. Bush as Henry V. Look, the best thing about Henry V is the beginning of the play Henry VI. How does it begin? Someone rushes in and says, King Henry is dead. And they say, who's the king? Well, this 18-month-old Henry VI. So everything Henry tried to do to stop faction fighting by going to France, his death reopened the whole thing. Plus, what else? They say, oh yeah, we lost France and we're broke. So whoever's cheering Henry V for the speech on St. Crispin's Day is watching the beginning of the next play and saying, whoa, I was duped. I was bamboozled. I was played. Henry V really was a jerk. Just like George W. Bush. I thought he was fighting terror, and all I find out is that he wrecked the economy and screwed up the Middle East. So this idea of tragedies, you take people over the top. And the idea is not to get them to sympathize with the little person, the victim, the person who's a victim of injustice, who has an indignity performed against them. But you're giving them an insight into the problems of a society which accepts certain axioms. Now, it's there in Miller. But I think Miller takes this point where he says it's really about the tragic flaw of the hero. And that's not what Lynn says. The hero of a drama is the playwright, to be a little provocative. Because the playwright is the one who's telling a truth to you that you might not want to face, including the fact that your so-called hero is not all that heroic, and that the society is the problem. The social practices, the social dynamics, that's what has to be changed. And so I think this point, Miller goes on to say that only the passive, only those who accept their lot without active retaliation are flawless. In other words, you don't have a flaw because you're not doing anything, you're just going along. Think about Incident of Vichy, how people at a certain point, I think Incident of Vichy is a highly insightful psychological drama. But, again, does it rise to this higher level? And he goes on to say, there are among us today, as there always have been, those who act against the scheme of things that degrades them. And in the process of action, everything we have accepted out of fear or insensitivity or ignorance is shaken before us and examined. And from this total onslaught by an individual against the seemingly stable cosmos surrounding us, from this total examination of the unchangeable environment, he's right about that, comes the terror and fear that is classically associated with tragedy. See, I think it's not that you want to make people feel sad or look at the fear to act, but the purpose of tragedy is to excite that higher faculty of reason, the senses above seeing and hearing. And this is the hard part to think about, what Lynn is talking about in terms of tragedy as a method of organizing. You can't really organize someone to change their life based on giving them 56 facts about how Cheney's evil, or 30 proofs that the banking system is going to collapse. What causes someone to change their life is when they get a glimpse of the potential of a human being that's being suppressed or destroyed by the society in which they live. Now, you can get there by catching their attention, by showing them that they're deluded if they think somehow they're going to have a decent life when you face fascism. Can you turn your back on what Schwarzenegger is going to do if you really know what he's doing? Can you consider yourself a good person if you say, oh, Arnie, he's a jerk, but I got a job to do. I got to keep going to work. Well, the obvious answer is no. But what will move someone to say, I really have to put in a significant amount of time, if not my whole life, to stop this? And that's where you have to raise it to that higher level. So you look at it from the standpoint of the whole society, from the standpoint of 3,000 years of history. And this is, I think, the ultimate point that Lynn is making. That Arthur Miller makes a lot of interesting points and good points, and I think he's an extremely gifted playwright. But I think his decision, part of what he says in here is, we're not all that concerned about kings anymore. And then he says, pathos truly is the mode for the pessimist. Now, this is this is the last paragraph. He says, tragedy requires a nicer balance between what is possible and what is impossible. And so that makes it optimistic. Well, in fact, pathos, or what Schiller calls the pathetic, is not pessimistic. The reason you are moved by seeing something that's tragic is because it inspires in you that higher faculty of action, so that you'll act on that which causes the crisis. Because you see, inside a tragedy, ultimately fate wins. I mean, this is, if you take a historic example, it already happened. You're not going to change 1945. We can't go back to the Future included. We can't go back to 1945, give FDR artificial resuscitation, bring him back to life, and have him preside over the destruction of British colonialism. So if you write a tragedy about the death of FDR, the purpose is not to cause people to hope that FDR lives, but to give them an insight into the littleness and terror of people, that they capitulated to Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells and the thermonuclear blackmail that was done at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so that we got frightened and became little and allowed tyrants like Truman and Churchill and Joe McCarthy, who was a petty tyrant, to dominate our society. And then you look at today and you look at people like Justice Scalia, John Roberts, John Yoo, this despicable character who wrote that if a president wants to torture someone, he has the right to order it. Think about the debates in the Senate on torture. You have the one person in the Senate who was actually tortured, John McCain, who's a war hero, who tried to lead a fight against torture. He failed. And then he embraced the guy who defeated him, Cheney. That's sort of a tragedy, isn't it? And what of the society? What of all the MoveOn.org people who sent out 305 emails after that happened? That's pretty tragic. What did that do? What about the people who eventually did sign on to the impeachment and then didn't insist that it take place? What about the citizens who said, I hate Cheney, I hate them all, and then won't join us? See, that's the point. They won't break out of what's acceptable. Joining us is not all that acceptable in normal society. But normal society allows fascists to kill. So how do you communicate to people that you have to break with the normal? And I think that's where this tragic principle comes in. And I'll just say this in conclusion. I think this is a really interesting debate to have. Especially those of you, don't feel badly if you thought this play was an interesting play. It was. Look at more of these. Here's something to ask ourselves. Arthur Miller actually starts by saying, in this age, few tragedies are written. It has often been held that the lack is due to a paucity of heroes among us, or else that modern man has had the blood drawn out of his organs of belief by the skepticism of science, and the heroic attack on life cannot feed on an attitude of reverse and circumspection. In other words, maybe to be heroic, you have to be more crazy or something. Well, we're not looking for crazies. We're looking for people of reason. And so in this question, I think this is the kind of discussion that we should be having and debating and taking up and looking at the great tragedies. Looking at, I think some of you did get to see the whole of Verdi's Masked Ball, which is a really moving operatic tragedy. Seeing Hamlet. There aren't very many good performances of Hamlet, but you can learn from watching several of them. Schiller's even harder. We're going to have to reproduce it. This is why we're doing the drama work, so that we, as non-professionals, can work to develop the insights in Schiller's mind as to what was going on, what was holding back his society, that he chose the Spain of Philip II, the England of Queen Elizabeth, the France of Jeanne d'Arc as subjects for the theater in his time. And I would just say that if you look at Schiller's essay, Theater is a Moral Institution, I think that's the title, isn't it? Yeah. You get some really interesting ideas from that, because then that's the way you can deepen this discussion of tragedy. Because what Schiller's trying to do is give people at the same time a sense that life is fleeting, life is precious. You can't be morose. You have to embrace life and fight for beauty. And sometimes beauty is found in places you don't expect it, including a good irony. And one of the best places to look for ironies that are unexpected is music. Because when you hear something that's unexpected, a little turn in a shift introduced by a Lydian interval that catches you off guard, or even something like the little fugue that Verdi has in The Masked Ball, where you can see that he's trying to do a Bach-type fugue and he can only sustain it for a few measures. But it's that which excites those higher faculties. And so the difficulty about talking about some of these things is that these are profound ideas that are outside of most discussion and are difficult to communicate in words. But we also are developing our minds through the battle to move and transform other people. And so it's in that kind of context that these questions become that much more important. So let me just encourage you. You can find it on the under Arthur Miller and Tragedy, his essay, Tragedy and the Common Man. I think it's very well worth reading. And I think studying these plays is very useful. He's one of the better American writers in the 20th century, maybe the best in the 20th century. O'Neill is very difficult. Although I think, to Lynn's whole thing on Hickey taking the life out of the booze, I think Lynn likes that so much that he's favorable to O'Neill, at least in terms of The Iceman Cometh. So anyway, why don't we just open the floor for some questions? Yeah.
I have two questions that I think are just tangents to the subject matter, but nonetheless, I'm just curious what you think. Didn't Arthur Miller give up some names to some authorities?
No.
He didn't? Okay.
No, that's why he was held in contempt.
Well, I thought...
He was told he won't be asked to name any names. So he went before the HUAC, and then they said, well, Mr. Miller, we're going to ask you who you were meeting with. And he kept saying, I was told I wasn't going to be asked that. He was doing that kind of thing. And they finally said, if you don't give us the names, you're going to be held in contempt. And he refused. And he was held in contempt and sentenced to 6 months in prison.
Now, what was the what would you consider the Iliad to be, and the Odyssey? I mean, I've been studying the Iliad, and so I'm just curious as to see. There's a lot of conflict within the gods themselves and amongst the Achaeans and the Trojans and just all over.
Mm-hmm.
And just some of while they seem to have certain moral values, as they're always praying to the gods themselves aren't the most moral of people.
Well, you have to ask yourself, here's Homer singing this story about the slaughter over what? The kidnapping of the wife of one of the Greek rulers. And the gods are on all sides. I mean, a lot of this is the fault of the gods, if you think about it. You wonder why Homer wasn't taken out and drawn and quartered. And actually, these stories became the language of Greece. These myths, if you think about it, from the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have the creation of a nation. So in that, it's sort of a national epic. Now, there are tragic elements of it. But I think if you want to look at tragedy has to be honed down a little bit. I think what you're saying is really the key, that Homer was educating people about what it was that caused the Dark Age for Greece. In a sense, the whole of the Iliad was the series of events which led to the collapse of Greek society in a Dark Age that only began to be turned around 200 years later with Solon of Athens. So it was the story of the events and the control which led to the collapse. And what was it? Superstition. Now, in that sense, the Odyssey becomes interesting because Odysseus, or Ulysses, is able to come home because he is willing to defy the gods. He's willing to think for himself. He's not as controlled. And so now then you want to take a look at tragedy. Take a look at the Orestian trilogy of Aeschylus, which starts with the story of King Agamemnon, who was the leader of the Greek forces. And his, the tragedy there, which is not ultimately a tragedy. The first play is. But the trilogy, the last play of it, is the establishment of Athenian democracy. So, and by Athena, working through Orestes. So, the point there is that you use the tragic to excite in people this higher sense of what did we do? How did we go wrong? What's wrong with the way we think and act? And you can see in this, from what happened to the people of Greece, what it was that was their failing. And a lot of it was the superstition. And from it you get these beautiful things that we still use today, like Cassandra, one of the daughters of the king of Troy, who, because the gods messed around with her and she messed back, she didn't give in. And so she was cursed. She was given foresight. She could see what was going to happen. She was an expert forecaster. But no one listened to her. That's what today when they call someone a Cassandra. Sometimes they say that about Lynn. Well, so what if he predicts everything? He's not credible. No one listens to him. Well, how could he not be credible if his predictions are right? You're not credible, buddy. So you see, you get those kinds of delicious ironies when you deal with this kind of real classical material. And the best thing about it is, it's for your mind. Classic tragedy is to develop the capacity in the audience or the reader to think above, outside the moment, outside your circumstances, to think in that arc of 3,000 years of history. And that's what Lynn has been saying, that's what gives you the ability to act with certainty, as opposed to just trying to shift things a little bit, just to get along a little better. Yeah.
Do you think that the play "All My Sons" achieved what you're talking about?
Well, I didn't see the whole thing. I'll tell you what I liked about it. What I liked about it was the way it opens, so that you're basically thinking you're just seeing a sort of banal story of people in the backyard talking and shooting the shit, and then you find out that part of the story is that they're freaked out that the mother doesn't realize the son isn't going to come home. You start thinking that's going to be the story, but you keep getting this thing about the jail and the basement, and then the guy was in prison, that's mentioned, so there's a bigger story. So you're drawn in that there's an unfolding of a deeper story there. Now, since I didn't see the rest of it, I don't know. The question is, What do you? I mean, someone who saw it. What do you come out of seeing it with? What's your sense?
Myself, I felt terrible. It was a very. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I thought it was interesting. Some of the commentary on the generation that would have been LaRouche's parents, essentially the parents of the World War II generation. Because I mean, as it twists around, I don't really.
Well, what did other people think? Who else said?
I thought it was the tragedy of a fantasy.
The tragedy of a fantasy?
Yeah, because the father, he was accused of killing 29 pilots because he sold engines that had cracked heads.
Yeah.
But because of his own insanity, because of the way he grew up, that when he was a child, I guess he was tortured by his parents, that he's got to work for every dollar. So that when he grew up, he's blaming his kids for his own insanity. He's saying, well, I what's the word? I spoiled you guys.
He's saying, I did it for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's what he starts saying.
Mm-hmm.
So then, and then the question comes, well, are you going to admit it? And then the wife is like, same question, are you going to admit it too? Are you going to give up that insanity?
Well, you see now, so what do you think, Aaron?
I thought it was, about the tragedy of post-World War II culture. That both the people who didn't go to war and stayed in the United States, and then also the guys who came back and saw the corruption, and many who couldn't deal with it and capitulated as well. I think it's directly on that.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's even this part when this guy says one of the main characters finds out some bad news, and it's really like destroying. And this one guy, the neighbor, shows up and he's like, sees the wife and she's sitting outside waiting for him to come home. And then she says, "Oh, I hope he comes back. I hope he comes back." And he's like, "Honestly, I hope he doesn't come back, because every man has this star of honesty, and every time they capitulate, more or less, then they lose it. It's brightness." It's kind of question.
You know, a lot of it is this question, though, of personal morality, isn't it? I mean, how do you sustain personal morality in an immoral society?
But well, even the main character, Chris, is that his name?
Yeah.
He even says, we fought fascism. This is what we did, and he pointed out at one point, he's like, this, what's going on with this family? Me trying to maintain my family, although I know my father's a killer, whatever. It takes me away from actually doing what's right. It's standing on principle and actually he's always counterposing like the idea of the soldiers in Europe or in Japan or whatever to when the soldiers come back. And there it's different. They actually have a sense of themselves having an importance in history. And then they come back and and even Joe says this too, is he talks about the factory. He's like, yeah, it's weird working in the factory because I have all these colonels, lieutenants, and all these people working under me. And, I don't know, I'm in here with heroes, but they're working for me. And it's sort of like, it just shows like this tragedy of all the soldiers sort of just bent back after the war.
What did you think, Alexandra?
Well, I'm on the spot. Well, I guess what I said last night, I still think it.
Just speak up a little.
Well, one of the things that I think was lacking is a real connection to the time period in which these people were living, in terms of the fact that they were fighting the Nazis, they were fighting fascism. But then the other thing is that I think that the creativity, the fight that they were having over this idea of man, it wasn't as developed as it should have been. And you had this father, and he was basically saying, I cheated a few things, but that's the way they ran the war. If you didn't have those pieces, 40 years of my job would have been destroyed over bad equipment I made over half a day. And half of the people in this country were doing it. They were trying to make money off of this war. But that's not exactly how the nation, at least, I wasn't there, but from the work I've done, that's not the case, that most of the nation really did rally behind the war and fighting fascism and Nazism under some moral principle. And so that wasn't true. And the fact that Odets had that guy saying that without a strong counter from the son, who was a decent guy, who did talk about, my fellow soldiers gave me warm socks. It was awesome. But there wasn't a real counter to that in terms of the historical significance of the time period.
Well, what I should do, I'll see the rest of it. I'll see the whole thing, and then we can talk some more. But again, from what I did see, and from what I'm hearing, is that look, these were battles that individual people had to face. Everybody, in a sense, in their life makes decisions. You all make decisions at some point in your life that shape the rest of your life. As Rihanna often says, I rue the day I stopped at the literature table and signed up and gave them my name. There's that moment where you changed your life. And you have to look back now. Some of you can look back over 5, 6, 7 years and have to answer the question, well, did I do the right thing? And how do you answer that? Do you answer it based on, well, am I happy? Does my mother think I'm doing okay? What do my friends think? What do my old high school buddies think? Or can you say, I'm being true to the principles of Socrates and the Pythagoreans. I'm living up to the challenge from Homer. And I think that this is really where this idea of, it's not that we're talking about kings and nobility. It's that you're looking at the society from the top down. I think that's the part of the point in the historically specific idea of Shakespeare. You look at the society from the top down, because everything is shaped by that. You could go to any single person, and look, just go visit your family and you get the same thing. Well, I could have been somebody, but my principal didn't like me. Or, my coach didn't give me the chance to get in the game, so I never became a pro football player. Or this jerk at work, they don't recognize how good I am. Everybody has personal tragedies, right? And some of these are real tragedies and really wrenching. They're not just boomer complaints, boomers whining. What makes it universal? And I think this point that he says that people are fighting for a sense of personal dignity. Well, if your personal dignity is not attached to something beyond just a minimal sense of what's just for me, what's justice for my life, but if you're not attached to this idea that you're acting in the interests of all those people who waged fights before you. And that's a hard thing to do, because Lynn sits around saying, well, I'm 3,000 years old, and he starts talking about this as though he was there when the Etruscans were waging their battles. Or when the debate was made with the people of the sea, do we become an empire, or do we go upriver and develop the savages? But these actually are the antecedents to your own personal development, whether you know it or not. And I think that's why looking at things from the top, the society from the top, is more true in the sense of how you get beyond the personal tragedy. You don't want to just simply say, can't we just get along and be better? You actually want people to leave with a more scientific conception of how to change people in your society. Yeah, Hector.
It's a very sad thing that...
Can you just speak up?
It's a very sad thing that Franklin Roosevelt died. But the thing that I've been thinking about in terms of what you're talking about right now, which is something that just raises the question, was that it was very clear to me what Roosevelt was intending to do, even beyond just from you telling us from briefings and from Lynn saying it. I've done enough work to understand that, damn, this guy he was going to end imperialism around the world. That's what he was organizing, and that's what he was going to accomplish. And I'm seeing the question that I keep playing around with, well, the guy died, yes, and that was bad. But, I mean, what is there to say about everyone else around him? Right? Like Harry Hopkins, even Elliot Roosevelt himself.
All right, here's look, you're starting to get at the important question, which is the leadership principle. What makes someone a leader? Just that people will follow them? Because people followed FDR, they voted him in 4 times. Martin Luther King, people followed him. I would say in my lifetime, you could look at the case of the civil rights movement as a tragedy. Because what happened after the assassination of King? Where was the leadership then? You had people in the streets. You had plans for the Poor People's March. You had all sorts of things that were being mapped out by Dr. King. So this comes back to the leadership question. The real tragedy, I think in most of these cases, where you have a person like an FDR or a Martin Luther King, it's the question of, are they producing other people who can be leaders? And this is the problem with the idea of the heroic. One of the things you get, if you read a lot about Beethoven, they talk about Beethoven's heroic period, where he wrote these stirring pieces inspired by the leadership of Napoleon. Now, look, there was a period of time where Beethoven was hoping that Napoleon would bring an end to the squabbling, immoral princes who were squatting over the territories of the states of Germany and Austria. But this idea of heroic is different from tragic. Because one of the things you get, if you look up in the dictionary, tragedy, it says, a dramatic composition, typically that of a great person destined through a flaw of character or conflict with some overpowering force to downfall or destruction. So the focus on the hero as opposed to the social dynamic principle of real leadership. And what's been the problems with republics? Why are republics so hard to sustain? You can set up institutions, but the institutions still have to be manned by people who are leaders. And the idea of a republic is that every citizen has to be imbued with at least the knowledge and the qualities and the commitment to the greater good. So here's an interesting question. People look at Martin Luther King and they say, well, maybe his tragic flaw was women, that Hoover was manipulated. Same thing with John Kennedy, supposedly. Same thing with Bill Clinton, right? Clinton's a smart guy. I mean, part of his tragic flaw was Al Gore. And we presume he kept his pants zipped up around Al Gore. That was a different problem. But look, think about this question of leadership. As charismatic as Clinton is, they say if you're in a room with him, you fall in love with him. I'm not just talking about women. I mean, this idea, here's a guy you have hopes for, dreams for. That's the heroic, but that's also a romantic conception. And see, I think this is also the problem with the romanticizing the tragedies of the little people. Feeling badly about what happens to little people. Because Hector, this is something we face, all of us. We talk about it a lot, the question of leadership. What makes someone a leader? I think, in some cases you could say, well, they're smart, they work hard, they're selfless, charismatic, what does that mean? The real question, I think, is the question of agape, the benefit of the other. And it's a difficult thing to teach other people that. You see, in Dr. King, you listen to his speeches, you look at what he did. He was inspiring people to act. The question is, how do you inspire people not just to act, but to develop those higher qualities in themselves? To connect the capacity to love other human beings, so that you'll act in the interests of the whole society without concern about yourself. And that's higher than acting to avoid an indignity. That's a higher principle. I think this is something that Miller missed.
It's kind of interesting, too, because the whole thing that really affected the father throughout this play was this idea between, like, the role of a father and son. Like, I had this business for you, my son. And the thing that got him to kill himself, the thing that affected him, was the fact that his
gave
son...
it away.
Yeah. Oh, shit.
That's okay. I'm just
That, you know, you know, it was just like this theme throughout the play. It was like the guy, what got him to turn wasn't some realization about something wrong in terms of the way his role was in society or something like that, but it was more that he and his wife had a certain emotional block, and the only way that it was ever really addressed is when it actually confronted them personally from the standpoint of their own son.
Well, that's again the problem with having the little man or the common man be the figure, because it could be love of a child or the inability to really truly love your wife or your parents or your neighbors or something like that. But I think this question that comes up in Hector's, what Hector raised, is where you really start to get at this question of the tragic. Why is it so difficult for us to act for the interests of the future? Why are we more worried about what one of our buddies will think about what we say or do than we are about whether we can be successful to create a better future for Africa? That's the FDR question. FDR had some people around him who, when he was there, they acted courageously. When he was gone, they couldn't do it. And FDR himself was a bit flawed in that sense. In King, it's even more profound a tragedy, because here was a person who actually understood instinctively or intuitively, because of his experience, the battle to improve the Constitution so that the Constitution is extended to everyone, and that it's not just about freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but of real opportunity. And that opportunity was that of economic justice, which required education and so on. So there, with King, you hear the love of humanity in his voice. But look at the people who he had around him. Look at Jesse Jackson. Who Lynn always says, well, you can't buy him, but you can rent him. It's all about Jesse. And so this question of leadership is the question that's posed to us today. What holds us back? How many of you see a flaw in another person over and over and over, and you go gossip about it with someone else and you don't try and do something about it? That's a courage that comes out of love of the other person, including their flaws. Doesn't mean you hug them and say, I really love you, bro, but you suck. But it means you have to develop for yourself that sense that you're doing it not because you're trying to get over on the person or control them, but because you know their leadership is necessary for us to move. Look at the problem of the deployments and things that go on day to day in the office. Here we are, we say we're trying to stop fascism and get a new global financial system in the next 15 minutes. So let's go out and deploy. Oh, by the way, so-and-so's not here. This other person walked off, and they took the keys to the car with them on their trip to the beauty parlor or wherever they're going. That happens all the time. So what's the emotion? You get mad. Now, when you see a pattern of a problem, even if it's just not a terrible problem, but someone's just doing something, you're not clear why it's happening. How difficult is it to talk to them about it? You know what you guys do? You come to Phil and me. After you gossip with each other about it. Now, that's what the boomers have done. Although sometimes the boomers will sit down and say, you know, I really wish you were a little different. You remember how it used to be with us? Now boomers are getting so old they can't remember that anymore. But this question of not having the guts to do the simple things that are really acts of agape. And I'm not saying we should spend all our time internally curing each other of all these bad quirks. The best way to do it, because look, a lot of things that you think are bad about people, if they go out and do something, they're not that way. So the first thing is you get out and do things. You define a pattern of activity that's necessary. Like this next, between now and February 5th. We've got to destroy the Schwarzenegger option and get people focused on the Homeowner and Bank Protection Act, getting it passed. And that'll finish off Bloomberg. If we defeat Arnie, if we do our job here, the February 5th primaries will be very interesting. Because we'll be shaping it around the HBPA. Now, everything we do should be oriented toward that. Is that difficult to figure out? No. So what's going to happen Monday morning? How many people won't show up who are supposed to deploy, or show up late, or have a complaint? So, these are the problems we have to take on. You might say, these are the tragedies of the little man that have to be solved by going to the top. Yeah.
You made an emphasis earlier that agape was difficult to teach.
All right.
Now, do you think that that's really the case, or is it that people...
Well, you can't teach it.
Right, that's what
No, you can't. Look, this is why Schiller is so important. This is why the work you're doing on Don Carlos is so important. This is why getting up and seemingly being humiliated when you try to act is so important. Because what you're really doing, and what Robert's helping people do, is get out of yourself and get into Schiller's mind. Now, the greatest artists are the people who have worked the hardest on overcoming their imperfections. Why? Why does an artist do that? It's not that an artist just has all these tunes in their head. Look at the struggle that Beethoven went through. Beethoven's the most transparent on this. In one document in particular, the Heiligenstadt Testament, go back and read Beethoven's struggle with the problem of being a creative musician, a composer, even though he's deaf. And he basically says, I was given this power by God to do things that are beautiful. And that's what I'm going to do, in spite of everything else that affects me, including the fact that most people around me are moral imbeciles. Even people like Goethe bow before the Duke. Beethoven he could get quite angry. And he spoke out. And he still produced incredible music precisely because of that. Because he worked on overcoming his imperfections. Now, you can't teach someone to be loving. It's like having a class on motherhood. If a mother doesn't want a baby, you can teach her how to stroke the head of a doll. That doesn't mean she's going to be a good mother. So you can't teach agape, but you can help people figure out what's standing in their way from acting for the benefit of others. But ultimately, this is a personal struggle. This is the struggle to be creative, to fight the blocks, to fight the fears, to fight against the invisible electric fence, as Lynn talks about, that keeps you from saying things that you really know need to be said. The subjective intervention. And to really be able to do a subjective intervention where you do address these problems in others, you know where you start? On yourself. You have to be tough with yourself. You have to make sure that you're doing things because you truly are acting for the benefit of others, rather than in some way trying to help yourself. And our society teaches people to be self-seeking, little, miserable, selfish creeps. And how to profit from that. That's what our society's about. That's what your education system's about. You know, meanwhile, I can tell you stories about music school. At a certain point, it's not about bringing the idea of the composer to the people in the audience. It's how do you get ahead of that stupid other person who practices 3 hours more than you do a day. We all have these things. You know, overcoming these kinds of ego problems. But what Schiller talks about in the letters on the aesthetical education, is how you work on yourself to overcome your own imperfections. And if you can do that and be creative, then you can present a body of work that will show people how the human mind works when it's freed from those kinds of imperfections. And that's what you try to do with tragedy. You get an audience to have a self-reflection. That's me trapped on that stage. That's me living in that set of flawed axioms. I got to do better. And so great art is really the province of the people who are the most agapic. You know, when people say, oh, Beethoven was really nasty to his friends, it's because they weren't really friends. He was trying to get them on a higher level, and they were talking to him about all kinds of crap. So occasionally he threw his food at him. He did things like that. I'm not advocating that. This office is messy enough as it is. But you have to have an intolerance for that in you that stops you from acting for the benefit of the other. And then as you develop yourself, you have those qualities of leadership. And being in a boomer generation, it's tough to do that because everything about the generation is me, 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 my pleasure. We had this really beautiful little clip on the website of Arnie. I hope people saw that. It was the slug I wrote on the These Cuts Will Kill. And at the end, we took a little clip from Pumping Iron, the Schwarzenegger movie, where he's sitting there for 3 hours in a row talking about pumping iron is just like coming. I get to come in the gym, and then I come at home. I come all the time.
Jesus. No, I never saw that.
I think it's still up there. You got to take a look at it. And then at the end we said, he'll be back. Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Hector.
Now, in that tragedy, if someone is put in that point of reflection, doesn't it just become a question of their own personal will, whether they're going to consciously change or not?
Well, personal decision is the starting point. But how many of you have decided you're going to change and then you wake up the next morning and do the same thing again? Now, does that mean you have no will or no determination? I mean, some of this is a question of where you place your identity. Look, Lynn made this very profound point the other night, which he's made many times, and which always strikes me because for me it's also a personal thing. When you do things, are you thinking about the implications of what you're doing for the 3,000 years before you and the next 3,000 years? Or are you thinking about what you need to do to be happy in the next 20 minutes? Or to look good the next few days? This is the recruitment question. Look, let's put it right out here. We have to recruit because that's how our ideas will be implemented. When you find people who develop the same passion for great culture, for great music, for doing things good for people, and you give them access to where they can go to make these discoveries for themselves. When the Monge Brigades function, so new people can come in and say, wow, Kepler's really something. When the chorus is done in such a way that people can find their own voice and realize that while they're developing their powers to sing with an instrument that was given to them by God or by nature, that as they develop their voice, they're developing it in a social context with the other people in their vocal species, whether it's soprano, tenor, or whatever. But they're able to sing with all the other species in a piece that was written hundreds of years ago that has profound meaning to you today. That's the question of simultaneity of eternity. To become a really loving person, you have to love that creative power that exists in all human beings, but it's only been realized by small numbers. And then make yourself a vehicle by which you can master those ideas, you can rediscover them, and then help others rediscover them. That's what being loving is. So an act of will, yeah, but what's the starting point? You look at the hell we face if Schwarzenegger goes through with these budget cuts. Look at the hell we face if we have a Mussolini-Bloomberg presidential campaign. And then you have to say, I'm going to do something to stop that. Now, how do you stop it? Well, it's not just going out and getting out leaflets or going out and talking to people. You've got to do that in the context of developing yourself. But there's no such thing as a personal development outside of that process. The worst thing is the person who says, I'm going to shut myself up in the room for the next 30 days and read everything I can by Kepler, and then I'll come out super person. In fact, anyone here will tell you that what you guys do, which is good, which the boomers couldn't do, is you work together. You work in a room where you take other people who are having trouble and try to help them in the same way you want others to help you when you're having trouble. Grasping an idea, working on it, helping you through a block, helping someone else through a block. That's what agape is. And so when Lynn says outreach in the recruitment process is a function of intellectual development, and intellectual development is done for the purpose of outreach and recruitment, that's not a tautology, it's true. Or it's not a moral imperative, it's true. What good would it be if one of you became the next Kepler and we went through 3 generations of fascism and war? Well, it might be better than if no one became another Kepler, but that's not what we need in our society. We need to stop fascism and war. Now, is there a contradiction? No, because the way we're going to do it is develop a cadre force. Cadre meaning a small group of leaders who have this principle of acting for the benefit of the other and who personally understand tragedy from the standpoint of what it means if I don't act to do that. Not someone on the stage, but if I don't act with all my capacity to do that. And that's how you strengthen your will. Because otherwise, if you're just saying, all right, I made 3 New Year's resolutions and by January 3rd they're all gone, that doesn't work. But can people become more loving? Sure. You know, most people when they start relationships, they're not really in love with the person. They think they are. They're usually in lust with the person. And a lot of times, they're really in love with themselves. And the image, especially men. Man, I'm really cool. Look at this chick I'm with. You know, that's what happens. That's tragic. That's not about love. Sometimes it takes 3, 4, 5 years to really know someone enough to really love them. And it's not because you have a fixed relationship, but because you're constantly fighting to develop each other. That's where you begin to get a sense of what it means to be a loving person. And I think every one of us can become more loving. And should, and will. You can get better. Look at Lynn. He's developing all kinds of new stuff. Why does he do it? Get his name in print? Think he needs that? All right, why don't we, I'm going to have to do a couple of other things, but are there any other pressing, urgent questions? Like, this is a really rich topic, and you could have a class on this every week for the next year. But it's the kind of material that we've got to master. Okay?